As the saying goes, those who would trade their freedoms for safety deserve neither. And so what I want to talk about today is essentially in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, there were a lot of people who were posting online, and even if they were not cheering specifically his assassination, they certainly were calling out his take on the Second Amendment and how, oh, look what happens. You essentially advocate for the Second Amendment and you say, even if the cost is a few children getting harmed in school shootings, well, that's a willing sacrifice for keeping the Second Amendment. And so people were basically taking that quote of his and reposting it, assuming that the fact that he was assassinated would have actually changed his opinion on that. And quite frankly, I actually doubt that. I think there were a lot of things that went wrong on that day, and I think he normally would have taken a lot of precautions, but that's just where it ended up. And so the thing I want to do is take a look at Glenn Greenwald. He actually did a segment on this, and I thought he put it very well. So I want to take a look at his coverage and then add some of my thoughts in there as well, because again, I think it's a very strong argument that he makes, and it's one that I believe as well.
And the question is this, quote, I have a question about free speech and its limits, especially in the context of what's happening in Palestine. You often emphasize ideological consistency in first principles, and you've also spoken powerfully about the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Given that, how do you think decades of dehumanizing rhetoric and normalized hate speech against Palestinians have helped create the conditions in which this violence is not only tolerated, but in many ways enabled, both by global leaders and by the broader public? To what extent has the unchecked spread of certain ideas and narratives, even into the banner of free speech, laid the psychological groundwork for this genocide? Not just among the Israeli leadership, but also among parts of the global public who still view this either as fake news or as a justified campaign to, quote, eliminate Hamas. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we reconcile the principled defense of free speech with the undeniable power of language to do real harm. And we are seeing now, as we are seeing now and repeatedly have seen throughout history. So it is a very good question. There was actually a point I wanted to make over the last couple of days, because there were a lot of Charlie Kirk quotes going around after he was murdered that were designed to cast him in a critical light, which I personally see nothing wrong with. I talked about how morally repulsive I think it is and corrosive of the soul to celebrate any human being's death. So
I think exactly to his point, and I think it's one that a lot of people have pointed out, and quite frankly, I agree with. But yeah, you don't want to whitewash someone's character. They may have said claims, and by bringing up those claims, you can show how, specifically in this instance, guess what? You are a victim of gun violence. And so pointing out where you said guns should be legal, you can make a statement about that. Again, to Glenn's point, without showing excitement about the fact that he's no longer with us, because that's sick and disgusting. But yeah, I mean, again, these are the beliefs that he held or that he espoused. And so, it's ironic that what happened, but yeah, I mean, you're well within your right to say that. Where it crosses over the line is where you say, I'm glad that happened or whatever. So yeah, you're more than welcome to call that out, because that is what he said, and we shouldn't be whitewashing the things that he has espoused. Again, how long ago did he say it? Like these sorts of things are also true, right? People can have evolving opinions, as I think a lot of people do over time. But to whitewash the things he said, I think is unnecessary and also disingenuous.
Separating that from when somebody becomes this very important figure in our discourse and culture, and there's one side kind of trying to glorify them and turn them into a symbol of a political movement, it's perfectly acceptable to speak critically of that person as well. He's part of our politics. He was part of our politics. He is part of our politics. And it's not a religion. You don't have to submit to anyone's hagiography. So I have no objection to people saying, you know what, actually, I thought some of what Charlie Kirk said or did was actually not worthy of praise, but was actually quite harmful. That's very legitimate.
And the other thing I'll say to that point as well is, and just him talking about him being a public person. When you are a public person, there are certain, I guess I'll say, risks, right? It's in the context of the assassination. Risk is maybe too strong of a word, because you would never want to believe that something like that would happen, where you're literally gunned down for your beliefs. But risks in the sense of like judgment, if you think about it that way, right? Where you can say something and then you probably know in today's world it's going to get misconstrued, it's going to get snipped out of context, and so there are going to be people who are going to disingenuously try and cast what you said in a negative light, or even just use the words that you actually said and have negative opinions about those opinions that you espouse. That's totally fair. You can't get upset about that. That's policing other people's speech. So you can have your opinion, people can disagree with it, and that's just something that goes along with the job, right? If you're a political commentator, if you're a public person, and you're going to give your opinions on things, well, then people can be offended at them or disagree with them or however they feel. And so that, I think that's part of the equation as well, is that and I'm sure, once again, it would be interesting to have his retrospect on it now after what has happened, like if he had survived, and to hear if his opinion changed on the Second Amendment at all. But yeah, to Glenn's point here, he's allowed to have his opinions and people are allowed to disagree with them. That's just part of being a public figure.
And one of the ways that's being done by the people who are doing that is circulating various quotes of Charlie Kirk to try and show, oh, look, these are the things that he thought. And one of the quotes that began circulating almost from the day that he was murdered, but I continue to see to this day, is the one where he basically was asked, okay, you believe in the Second Amendment. Well, doesn't that mean if we have no gun control, if guns are everywhere, that there are going to be certain gun deaths that could be avoided? Maybe there'll be kids who find guns and pick them up and end up accidentally shooting themselves or somebody else, which has happened. Maybe it'll mean that some crazy people will be more readily able to get guns and will kill people, as certainly has happened. A whole variety of ways that
And real quick to those 2 points. Number one, I would hope if you have a gun safety, have a vault, have something where, especially if you have children in the household, they should not be able to get their hands on it at all. And I'm not just talking like up away somewhere. I'm talking literally like you need some sort of case with a lock on it. I think that's a non-negotiable, because those are tragic, because they don't understand the severity of this is what could happen to me and this is what the actual consequences are of my actions of playing with it, and especially when it is glorified in movies and games and all these sorts of things. So that's on that one. And then the mentally ill one, I think, is especially prescient in today's society, because I think there are more and more, and I think social media is probably a huge part of it, but I think there are many things, our food, diet, all these, not getting enough sunlight, all these things I think are very bad for our mental health in general. And so it's more likely that mentally unhealthy people are getting their hands on guns and doing these sorts of actions. And I think that is what the real threat is there's always the argument of the Second Amendment and, we should get rid of guns and that kind of stuff. But no, I think it's more mental health. And I think that's what we are seeing now, it is truly a mental health crisis. And because, and this is the argument, and it's especially been making the circulations, but I 100% agree with it. There are many countries with essentially the same amount per capita of guns, but almost none for gun violence. And that's because, again, I think in America, it's basically screwing over the general population for companies to turn a profit, and that is in turn making us unwell. And that, I think, is the problem. And so you can't just point and say, oh, look, there's gun violence and gun violence is bad. No, how about we fix our society and stop letting these companies screw us over, so then we have a mentally healthy society, and then that problem will solve itself. And I understand that's a big ship to turn and steer, but again, I think it can be done, and I think that is because you can take away the guns, but then the other thing to think about is Europe banned guns in 1997. Now guess what? 28 years later, you're being put in jail for social media posts. Like, is that a world you want to live in?
Permissive interpretation of the Second Amendment might generate more deaths by guns. And being intellectually honest, Charlie Kirk said, yes, I think that's probably true, but it's worth it to protect the Second Amendment. Some deaths are worth it to protect the Second Amendment. And that quote was being circulated to try and cast Charlie Kirk as some sort of extremist. That, oh, look, he's willing to tolerate gun deaths in order to protect the Second Amendment. That's what an extremist he is. And also to imply that there was something ironic or even some kind of karmic justice about what happened to him, given that he was saying he's willing to tolerate deaths by gun violence in order to protect the Second Amendment. It turns out that his life was taken by gun violence. And as I said,
and I've already stated my thought on that, but I do think it is kind of ironic. It's not like he was, like, of all the topics, right? The thing is the thing that he did, right, in debating people, he's going to cover all topics. So he's going to give you his opinion on every single thing. Was this the hill that he was dying on? No. So to call it out, it's not like a pure, deep irony. It's not like he was a member of the NRA and was their head spokesperson. Like, that's truly ironic, right? But, yeah, I mean, there is some amount of irony. But at the same time, I kind of agree with him. I mean, I do 100% agree. And that's the thing is, the overwhelming odds is that you don't actually, like, more people are killed by cars than guns a year. So do we ban all cars? Like, what are you even talking about? It's not even a good argument. And so, yeah, that's the thing is when you're looking at these types of things, the consequences of not having the guns are thousands of people's lives are being ruined in Europe right now because they're going to jail for social media posts because the government isn't afraid of its citizens. The government needs, even if they have weapons far beyond what we possess, the government needs to be afraid of its citizens or it has no will to do anything for us. And that is why the Second Amendment exists.
While I don't mind criticism of Charlie Kirk, I find the attempt to use that quote against him to be so distorted and twisted in a very important and central way that relates directly to the question that I was asked, which is why I raised it, which is that I think it's so important to emphasize and to understand because it's not immediately obvious. It's almost counterintuitive, but it's nonetheless true. We have these Bill of Rights that most Americans affirm a belief in and often insist upon their preservation. First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the right of search and seizure, to not be searched without a search warrant, to have your papers and your person searched and seized or your home, due process rights, all the rights that attend to criminal prosecution, the right to remain silent, the right to confront witnesses in cross-examination, the right to an attorney, the right to have a jury of your peers, determine your guilt or innocence, all of these due process guarantees, and all the other rights of the Constitution as well. And every single one of them have significant costs to them, including the risk of death. If you allowed police carte blanche to just enter whatever houses they want, as happens in many countries, there's some murderer or a serial murderer or some serial rapist or pedophiles or terrorists or whatever, and the government wants the police to find them and tells the police, do whatever you have to do to find them. And if the police are able to just enter whatever homes they want and ransack them or search whoever they want, it's going to be easier for them to find those criminals, including violent criminals who are on the loose. But if you put barriers in the place of the police...
And that is such a good example. And this is really why I love how he looks at things. And I may not always agree with him, but a lot of times I do. Because that's exactly it. And that's why I say you need to put thought into how you actually, and seek out alternative viewpoints, right? Because if you can listen to someone voice something in that way where you go, oh yeah, well, think about these other things that you do agree with, right? You don't want to just be searched and, have the police barge into your house at any time. It's like, okay, well, that is a right that you should have, but guess what? There's a risk associated with it. Like he's saying, where, yes, they're not going to be able to find people. Or, the coke dealer, they might get away because they can't be searched unless they have a warrant. So, like, there's certain things where, yeah, unless you want to have your life massively inconvenienced all the time, because police officers can search you whenever, they can come into your house whenever, they can, any sort of suspicion, or just because they know there's someone in this area that they're looking for, and so they're searching all the houses, right? So by virtue of you did nothing wrong, but because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, well, now you're going to be inconvenienced. Is that the society that you want to live in? I mean, personally, I would rather have freedoms, but that's just me. So, yeah, amazing point that he makes there, and I think in a way that I would hope anyone would agree with.
Like the Bill of Rights does. If you say, no, you can't just go and search whatever homes you want. You first have to go to a court and persuade a judge that there's probable cause to believe that there's some information relevant to a crime, and only then can you enter somebody's home. If you don't have a warrant, says the Constitution, the police, the homeowner can refuse your right to enter, and you can't enter that home. And if you do enter and you search it anyway without a warrant, whatever you find won't be usable in a court of law. And obviously, not just that, but that right means that the police are going to be impeded in catching violent criminals. It definitely means that some violent criminals who the police may have been able to catch, had they been unconstrained in their searching power, instead are going to end up escaping the police and stay on the loose and maybe even kill again. Same thing with the privacy rights in terms of that we impose on the NSA or the FBI in terms of spying on Americans. If they could just spy on everybody, they would definitely be able to catch people more easily and solve crimes more easily. But because we tell them that you can't spy on us without warrants, we make it more difficult for them to catch violent criminals and to stop violence.
Do you want to tell them, or should I? So this one, obviously I agree with his argumentation here, but ever since the Edward Snowden leaks, I think it's almost laughable to think that any of us really have any sort of safety on our devices, and that they can't just get in, like Pegasus 2, right? How they can get into your phone just as long, if they even have your phone number, they can get into your phone. I think thinking that you have privacy when you have a listening device essentially with you at all times is kind of a farcical, but in concept, obviously, I agree with what he's saying here.
Violence from happening in the future. And there's no doubt that people have died as a result of those barriers that the Bill of Rights puts in front of the police. And the same is definitely true of due process rights. I mean, both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin said that they think it would be better to have, in the case of Jefferson, he said, I'd rather have 10 guilty people go free than have one innocent person punished. Benjamin Franklin said, I would rather have 100 guilty people go free than have even one innocent person unjustly imprisoned. And this came from British law and British legal thinking. And this is central to our Bill of Rights. The idea is that we do want to put barriers in front of the state to be able to put people in prison. All those rights that I just mentioned.
And that's another way to think about this that I think is good if you're thinking about it, right? Because imagine that, and I'm sure they thought this through when they were saying this, but imagine, oh yeah, there's 100 people that are out free who are known criminals, right? Because that's what he's saying is, I would rather have Benjamin Franklin, I would rather have 100 criminals go free than one person punished who is innocent. So that's the first thing to think about, right? So that he knows that these 100, 10 in Jefferson, but 100 in Benjamin Franklin's case are guilty people and they go free. So he knows that those people are probably going to go out and commit another crime. But he's willing to give that up so that one person who's innocent is not punished unjustly. And that's part of the risk freedom, I guess I'll say. I want to say risk reward. I guess freedom is a reward if you want to look at it that way. But that's kind of the argument there, is like, that is a risk, letting those 100 people go out and be free. But the reward is that no one is unjustly punished. And that is exactly the argumentation here, is that there's always some risk associated. And in that, it's very real risk. At least one of those, if not all 100 of them, are going out to commit another act of crime. But you need to be certain that, hey, the person that we're punishing, the person that we're prosecuting is not guilty. Or we need to be certain that they are guilty. So I think that just further illustrates it. But yeah, that's the founding fathers, the argumentation where they know there would be a negative outcome associated with it, but they're willing to trade it off for the freedom or whatever right that they have. And so that is, again, an even stronger statement, I think, than the previous examples, but a very good one.
The right against self-incrimination, to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to confront witnesses, to have a jury of your peers, all these rights that are guaranteed to you if you're charged with a crime make it much more difficult for the state to imprison you or to convict you of a crime. Even though the founders knew, and we all know, that means that in certain cases, guilty people like OJ Simpson are going to walk free. And we have decided that it's worth it. We're willing to have violent criminals walk free and not be convicted and not end up in prison to kill again in order to make sure that we have these due process rights.
And talk about violent in the OJ Simpson example there. And then also, by the way, he also committed another crime. If you remember, yes, he got off for the alleged murder of his ex and her boyfriend. But then he went out and stole memorabilia, literally theft. He went out and was swept up and got caught stealing back some of his memorabilia. Again, the risk is there, but they found him to be innocent, and there you go. So thankfully he didn't go out and murder again, but yeah, the risk is still there when you let him go. So that's the thing, again, to think about is, oh yeah, by the way, you don't want to lock up innocent people. Well, this is possibly going to happen.
And so each of these rights, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, all the rights of the Fifth Amendment of due process, and all the other accompanying rights relating to criminal trials and the like, they all result in death. They all result in increased violence. They all make it more difficult for the government to do things we might want the government to do. But we've decided it's worth it, which is what Charlie Kirk was saying. Yes, I'll concede, he said, that by insisting on the Second Amendment and by preventing certain kinds of gun control, there probably will be more deaths by gun violence, including types of deaths from gun violence that we wish we could prevent. But that's the cost of living in a free society. And that's all he was saying. And I think it's very important to understand that. Now, the reason I say it's relevant to the question is because the question was, does allowing free speech entail dehumanizing other people to the point where even genocide against them ends up being tolerable? By allowing free speech and Israel supporters to demonize Palestinians for decades, to deprive them of their humanity, to spread propaganda on behalf of Israel to the point where the world was even willing to sit by and allow a genocide to take place isn't that a gigantic harm from free speech? And the answer is yes. There's no question that protecting free speech often will entail not just problems, but serious harm to other people and probably even death.
And that's the thing. And what is actually, I would argue, is an even better way to think about this is that it wasn't even actually true speech, free speech. So like what actually needed to happen was true freedom of speech. And that's what is going on now. So yes, Israel has had the freedom of speech to say whatever they want, but you never got to hear the Palestinian side. And so that's not true free speech. If you're only hearing from one side, that's suppressing the speech of Palestinians and you're only hearing one side. So by saying, even just in the question and how it was teed up, it's like, well, that's not actually freedom of speech, because with freedom of speech, you would hear Israel's side, but then you would also hear the Palestinian side. And you would get to hear, oh yeah, well, they basically have us locked up in open air prisons. They control how we come and go. They control, they bomb us all the time. They stand up terrorist regimes essentially to rule over us. And then they use that as justification to go in and bomb us indiscriminately. Because that's literally what happened here in this current conflict. And so that's exactly it. Is even the question, if you think about it, is truly not truly freedom of speech. And what you're seeing now, which is in this conflict, how you're seeing everyone turn against Israel, that is because of freedom of speech. Because you can go on Twitter, you could go on TikTok before the Israelis just bought it, or the pro-Zionist Americans, whatever, the propagandists. Before they bought TikTok, you could go on TikTok. You could go on these platforms and see the horrors that are being carried out by Israel against the Palestinians. You can see Gaza completely leveled. You can see them blowing up, bombing buildings that are left standing, the few that are. And so that is freedom of speech. These platforms, and not being captured ideologically, have given Palestinians the ability to show the world, look what is happening. That is free speech. That is what I argue for. Because, again, freedom of speech in this example, we would not be calling out this genocide if we didn't have freedom of speech and we couldn't see what was going on over there. We would just get the legacy media telling us, oh yeah, they're just, they're taking care of those Hamas. We wouldn't be able to see the reality that is tens of thousands of Palestinian women and children who have been bombed and no longer exist. And that is the strength of freedom of speech, and we would not be able to decry what Israel is doing without it. So yes, historically, what has been seen as freedom of speech, but was not, it was controlled speech, that is literally proving the point that you need freedom of speech. Just this conflict alone, why it is so important to have it. And again, I think just a very good example, and 100%, I think proves the point of, answers the question perfectly.
In exactly the same way that all those other constitutional rights engender those kind of risks and damages, but we have decided as a people, as a country, as a culture, that the dangers of eliminating those rights, of allowing the government to censor, allowing the government to take away people's guns, allowing the government to walk into homes whenever they want, just on mere suspicion or a guesswork or a whim, or just convicting people that we know are guilty without bothering to go through the protections of the trial. We've decided that it's more dangerous to abolish those rights than it is to live with the cost of insisting on them, even though the costs are very real. And so, yes, of course, free speech means that certain people are going to get dehumanized. It means certain words are going to be justified based on lies. It means a whole wide range of bad things are going to happen, and that people are going to be convinced of all sorts of things we wish they weren't convinced of. But to me, the obvious solution is not to say, okay, U.S. government, we're going to trust you now with the power to censor because we're going to hope that you will censor speech that dehumanizes Palestinians. Do you think the U.S. government in its current constitution, I don't just mean the Trump administration, I mean all the presidencies before that, would use its censorship power to protect Palestinians? What we've seen is the exact opposite. Censorship is being used to silence critics of Israel.
And that's exactly it. That's exactly what I'm saying, is that is the way it has gone through history. So it's not even just the current regime. That's how we got to where we are. And that's how the question is founded and stated the way that it is. Because guess what? That's what has happened historically. And freedom of speech is what is enabling what is happening now, which is why I made that argument and why I think it's such a good one.
And that's true for each of one of these rights. And I think it's important to be honest, the way Charlie Kirk was being when his defense of the Second Amendment, which is to say, yeah, these rights do have costs. And sometimes those costs are even violence or the death of other people. But it's worth it because the alternative is living in a totalitarian state or an autocratic state or oppressive state rather than a free society. And that is the price you pay. That's one of the things I've learned in life is that there's nothing free.
And that's exactly it, is people don't think it all the way through. Like recently I was having an argument with a friend about it, and he was, oh yeah, the illegal immigration deportations, so awful, and Trump is the worst, and this, that, and the other. And at the time, it was before this newest round of free speech crackdowns. But I was saying, look, he stemmed the tide of all the COVID censorship, the Biden laptop, all the social media censorship that has been going on for the last 4 years. And so the price of that, though, well, sorry, I'm willing to give that up. I think this is the best outcome. Now there's crackdowns on free speech, and TikTok's getting bought up, and censorship is happening there. So it doesn't matter what color you put on the pig, the lipstick is on the pig. It's still a pig. It's still, they're still trying to crack down on freedom of speech. So it's still happening, but at that point in time, the question is literally, are you willing to essentially let a few people stay here and then you can go to jail for posting something online? And I mean, even in that scenario, well then guess what? You say yes. You say, yeah, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to give up my freedom of speech for illegals to stay in the country. Well, then guess what happens? Then someone like Trump gets into office, or Trump gets into office, or whatever, and now he's using that, and you're saying, I don't like that Trump's putting these, he's deporting these illegals, because eventually the pendulum always is going to swing in the other direction. Well, then guess what? Now you go to jail because you said that. For 2 years. We'll say, just like in England, you go for 20 months for voicing your displeasure with the direction that the government is going. Do you really, is that a world you want to argue that you want to live in? I would say, if yes, go move to China or something. Go move to some authoritarian, go move to North Korea. Good luck. Good luck to you. So that is the thing, is people don't think about the actual end state of what they're arguing for. And it's so stupid to even try and argue that any policy or anything should supersede freedom of speech as my number one issue. But then, guess what? Also, critically, as the example being leveraged here, freedom to bear arms. Same thing. You can't enforce freedom of speech if you have no way to protect yourself. Look at England right now. Thousands of people a year are being put in jail for social media posts. You can't protect your freedoms if you do not have the ability to do so. And that is what Charlie Kirk was arguing.
I think balance is the overarching law of the universe. Every time you gain something, there's a cost that's extracted. And every time there's a cost that's extracted, there's a value also received. And it's the same with political rights. There are benefits from having political rights, but there are also costs. I think that's what Charlie Kirk was saying. I think it's important for free speech advocates to acknowledge that as well.
All right, I think that about covers it. I just wanted to make the points there really quick. The other thing I will say, too, is that personally, and just using the Second Amendment here, because this one I have a much more nuanced take on it. As I just said, obviously I think it's still, the Second Amendment needs to exist. People should be able to own guns. However, this is coming from someone who does not own a gun. And as a quick aside story that I think is fairly interesting, I lived in an apartment complex, and there was essentially a drug deal that had gone wrong. And so someone got shot in the complex. I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? Everything was locked down. I couldn't leave to go to work. Like the whole entire complex was basically roped off with police tape. And so I was posting about it online and people were weighing in. And one of my friends was like, oh yeah, don't you think this is the exact reason you need a gun? And my response to them was, for what? Like my general viewpoint on guns is, if I get to a point where I need to use a gun or I need to have possession of a gun, I've made a lot of other bad choices leading up to that point. Obviously, that's kind of hyperbolic because, yeah, you could just end up finding yourself in a situation where stuff just randomly pops off. Like even in the nicest neighborhoods, right? A riot just comes out of nowhere and forms, or whatever, like George Floyd. Like really nice places got riots and looting and all that kind of stuff happening. And so that is the thing, though, is that on the whole, the way I live my life, I am not particularly concerned about wanting or needing a gun. But the threat to the government of, hey, if you try and step on our rights, we have some tool or method that we can try and rise up against you, well then there you go. That is the entire purpose of it. That is the true reason to have it. Do I personally think I need a gun? No. But do I want other people to be able to have them, and or do I want to be able to go out and procure one if I feel I need it? Yeah, I think that needs to exist, regardless of my feeling of them. Like I said, I personally don't think I see a reason to want one, need one, use it, that kind of thing. But hey, guess what? That is something I would also argue for, 100%. For any reason, any sort of sacrifice. I think the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, there's a reason they're first and second, is because those are the two most important ones. But again, just wanted to kind of lay that out. I thought it was very interesting. I wanted to provide a few extra examples to, if this is something that you struggle with where, hey, I don't really agree with the Second Amendment or I don't understand why it exists. Well, here's a few other ways to look at it that might be more enticing of thinking about it provocatively or in a different light than maybe you have in the past. So if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in this kind of content, drop me a subscription below. It really does help my channel grow. And if you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.